Hello and welcome to the next video in the Kilpin Knitting Club series. I apologise in advance, I was not able to move Amber out of the shot for this one, so she's going to make a guest appearance in this video. Please try not to get distracted. Now, this video today is going to be about how to do increases and decreases in your knitting. What I mean by this is you'll start with a certain number of stitches on your needle, but if you increase or decrease the number of stitches, you can get different shapes. So what I've got here is what looks like a very small sleeve. It wouldn't make a very good sleeve because it's a bit small for a sleeve, but I've sort of mocked one up to show you what I mean. Before I show you increases and decreases though, what I have done to this sleeve is I've done a different stitch at the bottom here just to show you what effects you can get just by varying the pattern of knitting and purling in your knitting. So it looks like I've done a completely different stitch down here, but actually all I've done is what's called ribbing. So ribbing is where you alternate knitting and purling stitches in the same row, so you get a sort of a much stretchier piece of knitting like this. So this is normal knitting here, sometimes called stockingette stitch or stocking stitch. It's kind of stretchy, but it's not as stretchy as you might like. If you're doing something like a sleeve or a collar perhaps, or the cuff around the bottom of a jumper, then you might want to do some kind of ribbing so it's got more stretch in it. So this bit here, these are all knit stitches that I've done, so you can still see they're a bit more open, but they're still the V shapes that I told you about. And the stitches in between are purl, so they've got the horizontal bar going across them. So what I've done here is I've done what's called a 1-1 ribbing, so I've done one knit for one purl, and I've just kept going along the row doing that. So while you're practicing knitting, you might just want to have a go at doing that. So rather than just doing the same stitch all the way along, you would do knit, then purl, then knit, then purl, then knit, then purl, all the way along. It'll look a little bit messy to start with, but once you start building up the rows, you'll start to see the ribbing coming out. You can do different ribbing where you might have 2 knit for 1 purl, so you'd end up with these bits that are kind of, they look a bit raised. They would be wider because you'd have 2 of them, and then you'd have a purl in between like that. Or you can do it the other way around. Have a play with different effects. When you do the other side, it's important to do the opposite stitch from the one you did before, because if you remember, if you do a knit on this side, it'll look like a purl on this side. So this is the effect you want here. You want to see that where you've got your knitting here, this is this column of knit stitches here, it's going to look like a purl on this side. So when you're going along where you've got that stitch, you want to purl it rather than knitting it, otherwise it'll go a bit wonky. If you want me to do a separate video to show you exactly how to do that, let me know and I can do one. That's pretty easy to do. Anyway, back to increases and decreases. So I've done a sleeve because this is an example of a time where you would do an increase or a decrease. It depends on what direction you're knitting it in. So I've started at the sleeve end of this mock-up sleeve thing, and I'm going up as if I was going up the arm like this. And what you might be able to see, it's a little bit bunched up on the needle, but what you might be able to see is I have actually got bigger as I've gone up. So I've started with a certain number of stitches here at the bottom after I've done my ribbing, but then as I've gone up this way, my knitting has actually got a little bit wider. Don't know if you can see that. The way I've done that is by adding increases. Let me see if I can show you on the camera. I'm not sure if it's going to be very clear, but what I've done is I've done every 5 rows or so, I wasn't keeping count, I have done an increase about here, so 1 stitch in from the edge. Yeah, you can see sort of there, I've just got a new stitch appearing out of nowhere. That's the effect you get when you do an increase. So it just adds an extra stitch into your row, and if you keep doing it, it'll make your work get bigger and bigger. I've done the same on this side as well to keep it symmetrical, but you could, in theory, just do it on one side. You could do them in the middle, you can do them anywhere. I've only done them on the edge because it makes it look a bit tidier. So I will show you, first of all, how you would do an increase. Get my needle in my other hand. So, because I've done it for 1 stitch in from the edge, I'm just going to do an ordinary knit for the first stitch. Let me shuffle them all the way up. I've got them in the middle of the needle. Okay. And then to do an increase, what you need to do is in the middle of your stitch, in between these 2 stitches rather, you've got like a piece of wool that goes across like a bar there. If you pull them apart from each other with a little bit of force and make it go tight, what you should see is you've got a single strand of wool there that sort of pulls across that gap. So let me just put this yarn at the back there out of the way. What you want to do with this piece of yarn is slip it onto your needle, your left hand needle, I should say. Slip it so that it pops on that side. So you're popping your left hand needle into the right hand side of this loop. So what I'm doing here is I'll just do that again. So I'm going to use the left hand. No, I'm going to use the right hand needle. Sorry, I'm losing my left and my rights today. Use the right hand needle to pull it upwards to make a sort of a loop, and then pop it on top of the left hand needle like that. So it looks a little bit like a stitch, but it's not. And if I was to just slip that off, it would just slip back into place. So I'll just do that again. So I'm using my right hand needle to get into that loop. I'm going to pull it up and over onto the left hand needle. So I've made an extra stitch here. Now I'm not just going to knit into that as I would any other stitch, because you'll end up with a hole. You need to do something slightly different with this one to make it look like it's nice and integrated with the rest of your stitches. And this is called knitting into the back loop. So normally when you knit, you would have just gone into there, but we're not going to do that. We're going to go into the back loop. Now, you'll find there's lots of different ways of doing this if you were to look up on YouTube a video of how to do this. I'm just going to show you how I do it. Not necessarily the best way to do it, but it's the way that I do it and it works for me. So what you need to do is turn your knitting over slightly like this, so you're almost looking at the back of your stitches. And then use your fingers and pull this loop that you've just put on your needle. Pull it so you've got a bit of a gap. Then take your right hand needle, go behind the left hand needle, and put it from top to bottom into that loop. So in pulling it upwards, you've given yourself the space to do that. I'll just show you how to do that again. So this is your loop that you've made. It's probably fairly loose anyway, especially because it's on near the edge. Just pull it with your left hand to make it a bit looser. Take your right hand needle. Don't forget you've still got a stitch on here, so don't let go of it. Take that loop that you've just made, make it a little bit wider with your fingers, and take your right hand needle, slip it behind the left hand needle, and put it into top to bottom, or right to left if you prefer, into that loop. Oops. And then take your working yarn and then put it between the needles as if you were going to knit, because effectively that's what you're going to do with it. And then pull it through, and you should be able to pull the working yarn through when you do that. And then slip the stitches off. So you've now got 2 stitches on your needle, but you haven't taken any extra ones off here. You've made a new one. You made the new one out of this bit of yarn there, which is here. It looks a little bit loose here. That's because I've been pulling it about, trying to show you how to do this with a camera in between my face and the knitting, so it's a little bit loose. As you practice, it'll look a bit better. And then you carry on knitting all the way along until we get to the end, and I will show you how to do it again at the other end. So here we are. I have knitted all the way along. Remember, I had an increase here. Again, it looks a little bit messy because I stretched it about a lot. But you can kind of see it. So that was the first normal stitch that we did there, and then just there, you might be able to see it. That one there, that's the extra one that we made. And then I've gone all the way along, and I've just got 1 stitch left to knit. This is where I'm going to do my increase stitch. So to recap what I did, if you pull your knitting apart a little bit, you should see in between the 2 stitches on your needles you'll have a little loop here. Not that one, that's the stitch I've just done, this one here. So what you want to do is, lift that loop up. It's not as loose at this end because I've got a whole row of stitches behind me, but you're going to pop that onto the left hand needle. Use your fingers to loosen that a little bit. Put your right hand needle behind the left hand needle and put that from right to left, or top to bottom if you prefer, into that loop that you've just made. Take your working yarn and then knit as usual and pull that working yarn through, and you've created an extra stitch on there. And then I'll do my last one as usual, and there we are. So I've got another row where I've just done an increase at each end. You can't really see that that's what you've done, apart from the fact you'll have ended up with an extra loop on your needle here and here. But as you work along and these stitches move away further down the needle, further away from the needle, you'll see that you've done an increase. And if you were to keep doing that, then you would see that your knitting is getting bigger and bigger as you go. Now, you may not want to do an increase on every row because it depends on how quickly you want to get bigger. I've only done an increase on every 5 rows or so here, so it's a relatively steady increase, but you could do it like every row, and you could do multiple ones on each row, so you could make it get bigger and bigger really, really quickly. So this is how you can create different shapes while you're knitting, because when you're making things like hats and jumpers and things, you don't necessarily always want to be knitting in a straight line and making a big rectangle. You might want to make other shapes. So a sleeve is a popular place to do increases because a sleeve is not a rectangle, or it's not a tube that's the same diameter at the top as it is at the bottom. It gets bigger because your arm gets bigger as you go further up towards your shoulder. So decreases are the opposite of that. Now, they are simpler and more complicated in different ways. So they're simpler because you've not got quite as much faffing about with the stitches on your needles like I've just shown you. It's simply a case of stitching 2 stitches at the same time. But it's more complicated because there's different ways to do it. What you'll end up with, as I can't show you because I haven't done any in here, but we're going to do one together just now. What you'll end up with is, if you can imagine, you've got 2 columns of stitches here. What you'll get is they just merge into one, and then so if you've done a decrease, if you imagine you've done one here, they would just merge together and then you would just have one. But there's different ways of doing it depending on how you want it to look. Because depending on where it is in your pattern, you might want it to lean one way or the other. So it wouldn't be a perfectly symmetrical blend. They wouldn't be going right up the middle. It'll lean slightly from one side or to the other. So depending on your knitting pattern, it will tell you which one you should be doing. There are quite a few different ways to do decreases. I'm not going to show you how to do every single one because frankly, I'm not familiar with all of them. I'm just going to show you the ones that I normally do. But for that, I'm going to have to do it on a knit row, and as you can see, I'm not going to do a knit row here. I'm going to do a purl row because I've got my purl stitches here. So I'm going to go away and I'm going to do that, just one straight line of purl, and I'll come back and then we'll do it on the next knit row. So there we are. I've just gone along and done a purl row on the back of my work, and now we're back to knitting again. I should say most increases and decreases are done on a knit row rather than purl row. It is possible to do them on a purl row, but I don't know how to do them, so I'm not going to show you how to do that. And in most knitting patterns you'll be asked to do it on a knit row anyway. It's just a little bit easier. So why would you want to decrease? Well, it's the same reason that you might want to do increases, is to change the shape of your knitting. So if you were doing the sleeve in the opposite direction, let's say you'd started at the shoulder and were working your way down, you'd need to decrease to make the work smaller as you went. So the first one I'm going to show you is arguably a bit simpler. So I'm just going to knit this first stitch as per usual. And then I'm going to do a decrease here. So a decrease always involves 2 stitches because you're going to go from 2 stitches to 1. So the first one I'm going to do here is super simple. I've got 2 stitches here. It's the first one and then the one behind it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to knit, but rather than putting my needle into that stitch as I would normally do, I'm going to put it into both of them. Now be careful that your needle does go through both of them, like that. So be careful that you're not doing that, which is where it's gone in between them. You don't want to do that. You want to go through them. But it's the same principle. You're going from bottom to top into the stitches behind your left-hand needle, but you are going through both of them. And then you just take your working yarn, loop it through as if you were going to knit, pull it through, and pop both stitches off. And you've only ended up 1 stitch there, but you've actually decreased the 2 columns of knit stitch that you had there into 1 stitch. I'll just do a couple of normal ones and then I'll show you how to do that again. Okay, I'll do it again. So I'm going to decrease using these 2 stitches here. I'm going to put my needle as if I'm going to knit, but I'm going to put it into both of these stitches at the same time. There we are, making sure I don't go through just one of them, I want to go through both of them. And then just knit. And yeah, you've decreased. You've only got 5 stitches on your needle there, but we've actually gone through 7. And you can kind of see you've got 2 columns of stitches here that have all of a sudden gone into one. So that was fairly straightforward. If you're following a knitting pattern, we'll do this in a separate video, but if you were to do a decrease like that, it is referred to as knit 2 together, because that is exactly what you're doing. You're just knitting with 2 stitches together to make one. I should have said, if you're doing increases, patterns will refer to increases like as a make one. We'll cover that a bit more when we talk about patterns, but it's called a make one because that's what you're doing. You're making a stitch. Alright, so I'm going to show you how to do another decrease. I'll just do another couple of ordinary stitches to space them out. I'm making a very strange shaped piece of knitting here. Alright, and then the next one I'm going to do is called a slip slip knit, or SSK. This is trying to describe what you're going to do when you're going to do this decrease. It's a bit more complicated than the one we've just done, but it leans the other way. So what you sometimes find in a knitting pattern is that you'll have a combination of both to try and make it look symmetrical, because all of these things that we're doing, all these increases and decreases, are going to be visible on your knitting, so you want it to look as neat and as tidy as possible, and in some cases you need it to be symmetrical. So we're going to do a slip slip knit. So we slip our right hand needle into the top stitch as if we're going to knit it from bottom to top behind the left hand needle, but we're not going to knit it, we are just going to pop it off. We've slipped it, that's what it's called, is we've slipped that stitch. It's called slip slip knit, so we're going to do another one. So we're going to put our right hand needle into the second stitch as if we're going to knit it, and we just pop it off. Slip your left hand needle into the front of those 2 stitches that you've just slipped. Turn your right hand a little bit to make the needles parallel with each other like this, to make it a bit easier. I tell you, Amber's ruining the continuity of these videos because she keeps moving in between the takes. Now, it feels like we're going to knit because you've got your needles in the same position as you would do if you were going to knit, and that's because we are. So take your working yarn and loop it around the needles as if you were going to knit, and then pull your right hand needle back to pull through the working yarn, just as you would if you were knitting, and slip both of those stitches off. And there we have it. So we've done exactly the same thing. We've got 1 stitch here, and we've got the 2 stitches that we've just slipped off here. I'm going to do a couple of normal stitches and then I'll do that again. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to slip our right hand needle into the first stitch as if we're going to knit, but we're just going to pop it off. Same with the second one, and then tuck your left hand needle into the front of those loops. Put your needle sort of parallel with each other to help that make it a bit easier. Keep both of the needles in place like that. Take your working yarn and then wrap them around the needle as if you're going to knit, because you are, effectively. Pull it a bit tight. Take your right hand needle, pull the working yarn through, and then pop both stitches off. And then you'll end up with just 1 stitch there, and you've decreased because there's 2 stitches there. What you'll end up with is, once I get to the end, you will end up with a very strange shaped piece of knitting, or at least I will, because I've done lots of increases and decreases in this piece of knitting. It's no idea what it's going to be anymore. It's having an identity crisis. Just going to keep knitting to the end. And there you have it. You're not really going to be able to see very clearly, just because increases and decreases aren't that obvious until you've knitted a bit further and you can see it properly. Yeah, here we did an increase. I don't know if you can see. It's a little bit. It's a few rows back now, but we did an increase there, and we did an increase here. But then we've gone along and we've done some decreases. So we did a knit 2 together, which was this one and this one, which was simply where we knitted, but we put our needle into both stitches at the same time. And then we did a slip slip knit, which was this one and this one, which is where we slipped, as if we were going to knit, but we slipped instead of stitch the 2 stitches one at a time off one needle onto the other one. We slipped the left hand needle back into those stitches and then knitted those. It feels like you've done kind of the same thing, but not quite. Again, I'm not sure you can see clearly here, but they are designed so that they lean in different directions. So one goes one way and one goes the other. I'm not sure how clearly you can see that on here, but that's the reason why you often find them in combination in a knitting pattern, is because if you want a symmetrical effect, then you want some of them to be leaning one way and some of them to be leaning the other. Like I said, there's different ways to increase and decrease, and you'll find tutorials on how to do them on YouTube, I'm sure. These are the techniques that I use, and they're the ones that I most frequently come across in a knitting pattern. The increase stitch that we did down here is called a make one. So if you find them in the knitting pattern referred to as a make one, that's what that is. And if you'll see the decrease is referred to in knitting patterns as a knit two together, which was this one that we did, or a slip slip knit, which is what we did here. And the pattern should specify. If it doesn't specify, if it just says decrease, I just tend to do knit two together because it's just quicker. It's just a case of doing a knit, but instead of one stitch you do it with two. I hope all of that's made sense. And again, I apologise for the presence of Amber in all of the shots, and she's ruined my continuity because she kept moving around. If you get stuck with practicing your increases and decreases, as always, leave me a comment on the YouTube video, or you can send me a WhatsApp where you can send me videos or photos of where you've got to, and I'll try and give you a hand. Thanks very much, and I'll see you later.